Hello, everybody. I am finally back from my exams for chemistry, which I probably bombed. But actually, I did bomb. But okay. Sorry, it's been a long time. But this is Plato Metaphysics. All right, let's get into it. So, if you really want to get like a full reading, it's Plato's Phaedo. I think a lot of people like it. It's philosophy 101. It's something you have to know, right? If you're doing philosophy, or if you just want to learn, that's cool, right? I like that. Okay, so Plato's theory of forms is that Platonists think that we need to appeal to abstract objects in order for many of our first-order claims or sentences are to be true. Such thing as predication, like this tree is green, right? Everything in the physical world is flawed, which is claimed by Plato, by the way. How is it that many objects can have one thing in common? So the answer to this is universals. So Plato suggests there are two realms of reality: being and becoming. The world of becoming is the everyday empirical physical world we see around us, and the world of being is the realm of forms. And so forms are perfect items or things. They are non-physical, non-spatial, non-temporal, which means that they're intangible, right? They're outside of time and space. They're eternal and unchanging. Okay? They don't change. A form is a single property existing independently of all other properties. Example, there is a form of cat. This is absolute perfect catness. Universal cat with no properties, right? No size, no shape, no mass, just pure cat. And so Plato's theories of forms continue. And so Plato says material objects participate in or resemble the forms or are the instantiations of the universals. So, if you look at Jay Dyer's video about particulars and the universals, he actually gives us a really good example. But anyways, he basically, if we think of something general like catness, the idea of a cat, then when we look at a cat that we see on the mat, that is the particular. That's the instantiation of the universal. For Plato, what's more real is not the physical instantiated cat in front of you. What's more real is the universal cat. So why do we speak of a universal idea? Plato reasoned simply because that's what obviously makes a cat a cat. It's not that it has four legs or eyes, etc. Because a cat could lose those stuff and still be a cat, right? So the cat doesn't lose catness because it lost a leg or an eye. Thus, Plato argued the essence of a cat or the idea of cat cannot be identified with any of its traits. Essence is that which a thing must have to be that thing and no other thing. Universals relate to the problem of the one in the many, right? The one in the many is one of the major philosophical problems in philosophy, which you will get into. Actually, we just probably explained it, but you will probably get that in your philosophy major, or just like watching a YouTube. They're mentioned. So Phaser, Edward Phaser, by the way, goes on and says that when we look at properties like redness, roundness, etc., these are properties or features that cannot be identified with any single object. And obviously they have to have some reality, because then we're going to run into a whole host of epistemic metaphysical problems. So abstract objects then cannot be identified or reducible to matter or the instantiations of matter. There must be some notion of triangularity that's not just identifiable with the secondary characteristics or features of the objects in front of us. And so there's a distinction between the higher and lower forms. Lower mathematical forms are forms that are comprehended through mathematical operations or understanding. Their copies in the world of becoming are tangible. For example, tableness. And the higher philosophical forms are forms that are comprehended through philosophical reasoning, right? So their copies in the world of becoming, at least partially, are intangible. Examples are like justice. And so here's the allegory of the cave. And so this is what Plato is trying to say. So you imagine people who have been trapped in a cave their entire lives, facing the wall. Behind them is a large fire, and in between the fire and the prisoners are various objects and people. These objects cast shadows on the wall, which the prisoners can see. Since they've never experienced anything else, the prisoners would assume that the shadows are the real things. In the same way, we are like those prisoners, right? The physical world we experience is just a collection of shadows, or mere representations of the true, underlying reality which exists in the realm of forms. And so, how do we come to know the forms? Right? You might be saying that. So, how do we come to know the? How do we come to have knowledge of the forms? Well, Plato says, guess what? Your soul is immortal. Your soul survives death. Your soul had already pre-existed before your birth. Okay, before you were born, Your soul was directly aware of the forms, but now you've forgotten much of these experiences, but you can regain this through what he calls the process of recollection or just remembering. So knowledge of the forms is possible if we train our minds, we can remember them, right? Thinky, then you can know them again. And so Plato demonstrates this through the slave war example where Socrates led a slave to remember mathematical entities because before he was born, when his soul had access to the forms, right? Or when his soul had access to the forms. And the boy just simply remembered and learned it again. And so death. So death is a good thing for Plato because it's freeing somebody's soul from the body that holds it as a prison. Death frees the philosopher's soul from the prison of the body and it returns back to the world of being where it will spend eternity contemplating the forms. Phaedo. And so here are the arguments for the immortality of the soul in the Phaedo. And so one is the argument from generation out of opposites. So everything that emits of generation coming into being is generated from its opposite. For example, something that becomes bigger must have been smaller before. And so the application to life and death is just since life and death are opposites, the living must come from the dead, just as the dead comes from the living. Conclusion, this implies that the souls of the dead must exist in some form or place from which they are reborn, and the soul exists in some way after death, awaiting rebirth. So, if you read Saint Augustine, Saint Augustine, I mean, uses a lot of Neoplatonic philosophy in his, Christian philosophy, and this is one of the concepts is that the soul is immortal, right? And so, second argument is the argument from recollection, and this is again in the um, remembering process, right? Thinky to train our brains, and then we can remember this thing. So Socrates introduces us the theory of recollection to address the paradox of inquiry, which is just either we know the answer to a question or we just don't. Right? If we don't know the answer, we can't recognize it when it appears. Thus, inquiry seems impossible. Recollection and learning. If learning is really recollection, then we must have learned something before, which implies that our souls existed before entering this human form. The soul must be immortal as it existed before birth and retains knowledge from past life. And so the third argument is the simplicity argument. Premise. So Socrates argues that the soul, being simple, is not made up of parts. Um it doesn't have composition basically. It's not liable to disintegration. Things that are composite like physical objects are subject to breaking, right? Obviously apart, but things that are incomposite are not, which is the soul. And so the conclusion is just since the soul is simple and not made up of parts, it will not be subject to dissolution or destruction after death. And so thus the soul is immortal and will continue to exist after death. So here's a diagram of Plato's Metaphysics, and here's just the world of senses, obviously things that are composite, things that change, and then the world of forms are things that don't change. They're simple, right? And so here's Plato on truth. Plato believed that truth is a metaphysical as opposed to epistemological, right? Notion. Truth is a matter of how things are, not how they can be shown to be. Truth depends on being. Statements are true in virtue of how the world is, right? And in virtue of highly complex metaphysical structures and relations. And so this is Plato's divided line, a picture of Plato's ontology. And we've explained this before. That's basically it. Thank you.